Hey, welcome back. We're going to look at naming binary molecular compounds. And just a reminder, molecular compounds, those are molecules. They're normally always non-metals and non-metals. So for instance, something like BF3 or something like NI3 or something like, PCl5 or P2 O5 or P4O10. That's quite a few there, right? So those are all examples of molecular compounds. They're all pairs of nonmetals. And why binary? There's two elements. So there's a B and there's an F. There's a P, there's an O. There's a P, there's a chlorine. So if there's more than two different elements, right, that might be much more complicated for us to name. So we won't worry about that for now. But the naming rules are actually just like we had when we named ionic compounds. So the rules go something like this. So rule number one is name the first element as, or using the element name. So name the first element using the element name. And then rule number two is name the second element using the element name with the ending changed to IDE. Now, these are pretty much exactly the same as the ionic naming rules. And you might say, well, okay, that seems pretty easy, right? But the problem is if you had something like NO or N2O or NO2, right, then all three of these would get exactly the same name using these rules. So they would be nitrogen oxide, nitrogen oxide, nitrogen oxide. And all three of them are very different. So for instance, the center one here is nitrous oxide or laughing gas. This is nitric oxide, and this is actually when you take something like Viagra, it actually breaks down and makes this gas that causes an enhanced blood flow to, hopefully you know where. And NO2 is a gas with a particularly awful odor, actually, that I kind of like it. It smells kind of like hospitals to me, but it's a very poisonous compound, so you definitely don't want to breathe that in. So we're going to need a way to distinguish between all three of these here. So here's how we're going to do it. We are going to use prefixes. So I guess this is rule number three. We're going to use prefixes to indicate the number of each atom in the element. And the prefixes actually go off of the Greek word. So I'm going to give you prefixes 1 through 10. So let's see if I can count to 10. So it's kind of challenging, actually. And let me switch to blue. So if you've got one of something, the prefix you're going to use is mono. And by prefix, I mean you put it before the word. So pre means before. If you've got two of something, that is going to be di. So if you've got three of something, it's tri, like a tricycle. 4 is tetra, kind of like Tetris. 5 is penta, like a pentagon. And then 6 is hexa. 7 is hepta. 8 is octa, 9 is nona, sounds very Christmassy, and 10 is deca. So those are the prefixes that we're going to use. In actual fact, you may have seen these before. A monocle has, one piece of glass that you look through, right? A hexagon has 6 sides. October, right, used to be the 8th month of the year. Okay, well, it's not anymore. It's the 10th month of the year, but October, November, December used to be the 8th, 9th, and 10th months of the Roman calendar. There's one more rule, which actually, I really hate this rule, but anyway, it goes something like this. And the rule says, don't use mono for the first element. So we don't use the prefix mono for the first element. And we do for the second element. So if you've got one nitrogen in pole position, right, you don't write mono in. But if you've got one oxygen in the tail position, then you write mono in for that one. And the only other thing is we're going to use the prefixes for the numbers, but sometimes we will remove the last vowel. I guess we should say sometimes remove the last letter, which is a vowel, if it sounds better. Okay, I don't know a better way to say it than that, but let me go ahead and run through some examples and we can go through these rules together. So let's go ahead and go through NO and compare that to N2O and maybe compare that to NO2. So what do we have? The first rule, right, says we use the element name. So for the first element, so that is nitrogen. And then we write oxygen. We change the ending to IDE, so oxide. Then what do? Then we write prefixes. So there's one nitrogen, so we write mono. And there it is one oxygen, so we write monoxide. And I've already made a mistake, right? I've actually made two mistakes here, technically. We don't use mono for the first one, so I'm going to remove that mono right there. And then the second rule actually is kind of squirrely. And remember I said you leave off the last letter of the prefix if it sounds better. Well, monoxide, let me say that. Monoxide, monoxide, so that O sound, right, is quite difficult to say. So because of that, we actually decide to leave off that last letter there. And so it's just nitrogen monoxide. So sorry for that. And if we go to N2O, there's two nitrogens. So it is dinitrogen. And then it would be monoxide, but you get that sound again. So it's just monoxide. And NO2, there's one nitrogen, but we don't use mono for the first one, so it's nitrogen. There's two oxygens, so it's di. Oxygen becomes oxide. And dioxide, that sounds just fine. So we don't lop off the last letter of that prefix or anything.